Welcome to My Favourite Beatles Song, the podcast where we celebrate the music of the Beatles with a distinguished guest. I'm Tim Tucker, and with me today is songwriter, producer, and multi-instrumentalist Nick Frater. Welcome, Nick.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, great to have you on. And I've got to establish your Beatles credentials a little bit first. First question, what's your earliest memory of the Fab Four?
It's it's not a kind of cool one. So I was a bit of a late bloomer when it came to kind of the Beatles and pop music. My parents basically listened to classical music. So as a kid, I learnt the violin. So my first exposure was playing when I'm 64 on the violin in a school orchestra.
Great.
And it was unrecognizable from what it should be. That idea kind of stuck with me of why I think the Beatles have stood the test of time is that their songs can translate to, a bunch of kids scratching away on violins or panpipes or something, in a way that maybe, I don't know, a whole lot of love wouldn't.
Yeah, they were definitely the first pop rock act to be sort of transcribed to classical context, weren't they? Did you connect that music to the band itself at that point, or did that come
Not,
later?
not really. It was kind of when I put down the violin, picked up a guitar when I was about 12, and then I was given some copied tapes of Beatles albums recorded off vinyl, where I had a copy of like the White Album and stuff, and that was when I started to kind of, yeah, it just arrived at the right time in my life, and an obsession ever since.
Perfect. And yeah, I just wondered if you had a favorite, obviously getting to know the Beatles over all that time. Have you got a favorite period?
It's probably when they stopped trying to do it live. So the sort of 66 through to 69 is what the bit I listen to the most. And where they kind of really embraced the kind of the potential of the studio. And I think you've already covered it, but things like Yellow Submarine, I think is actually one of the most important recordings of the 20th century in terms of bringing the use of like found sound and kind of quote unquote samples into popular music, paved the way for lots of stuff that followed since. But we're
Yeah.
not here to talk about that song today.
No, that's a really interesting insight, though. Yeah, we did talk a bit about that when I did that with Grant McPhee. But yeah, there's and what we're going to talk about today is has some similarities there, doesn't it? So that's fascinating. I see from your backdrop that you've played and recorded at Abbey Road. But my next question was going to be: have you met any of the Beatles or their entourage, or seen them live?
I saw Paul McCartney last year, which I don't know why I hadn't tried to see him earlier in my life. It's just one of those things. But yeah, we saw him in Manchester, and we were not quite front row, but close enough to get singed by the pyrotechnics, and close enough to be able to hear the band on stage rather than through the PA, which was, yeah, absolutely fantastic. Um, I haven't really met any of their entourage. Because I'm way too young. However, my in when I was doing GCSEs at school, our music teacher was a guy called Richard McFall, who was the son of Ray McFall, who ran the Cavern, which is absolutely useless trivia.
Yeah, no, I grasp onto 7 degrees of, is it 7 degrees of separation? Yeah, they're all useful, aren't they? But yeah, tell us about your recording at Abbey Road. What was that for?
I mean, all sorts of stuff. I've done it a few times now. It's actually on Facebook earlier. It clocked up. Today is the third anniversary of the first time I got to record in Studio 2, which was I was playing piano for a guy called Scott Gagner, who's excellent. Everyone should check out his stuff. Um, but yeah, he sort of invited me kind of without mentioning where we were going. It's like, oh, I'm over in the UK. Do you fancy joining me to do some piano? I'm like, yeah, of course. And it was about 2 weeks before I got kind of an email from the security team at Abbey Road being like, can you confirm your driving license and your registration number? I'm like, we're going here? What? um, and he'd gone down a whole rabbit hole of making sure that the mics that we used for the singing was the exact serial number mic that A Day in the Life was recorded on. Um, which was, yeah, it's an amazing space to be in. And then earlier this year, I'm recording I've lost count. It's either the 13th or the 14th album. Um, and we did a session with my band at Studio 2. And yeah, it was as good as I'd hoped it would be. So we had all the Mrs. Mills piano and you know, set it all up exactly kind of, yeah. We had the
Yeah,
long Hammond organ out and all the rest of it, and it was
great.
absolutely fantastic. And I had, for one of the songs, I needed to have, I say needed, I wanted to have 12 acoustic guitarists. Um,
Right. Okay.
get that kind of traveling Wilburys, kind of
Oh,
like
right. Yeah.
loads and loads of acoustic guitars, which was also an excuse to get all my musical friends in to the session. Yeah, we scratched lots of itches that day.
You know my name. Look up the number.
The song you've chosen today is You Know My Name, Look Up the Number. It was recorded over quite a long period from started in May 1967 through June 1967. The backing track was shelved for a long time and picked up again on 30th of April 1969. And finally released as the B-side to the single Let It Be on the 6th of March 1970 in the UK and the 11th of March 1970 in the US. We'll talk about this torturous journey, I'm sure, from conception to release, but it didn't actually get released on an album until the Rarities album was released in 1979 in the UK, 1978 in the US, and finally on CD on the Past Masters Volume 2 compilation. So those are the facts, but tell us a bit about why you chose this song and what it means to you.
I think it's because it's such a kind of it's a lesser heard Beatles song because even with some of my kind of my musical nerd friends, you stick it on, they're like, "What the hell's this?" I'm like, "Oh, this is the B side of their last single before they split up." And I think it's kind of because it's so weird and it's kind of almost unique sounding in their catalog, possibly because it's had such a long journey. Because I think possibly only Then and Now, or Now and Then, whatever the last single was, has had maybe slightly longer between starting and finishing. To have the end of their kind of while they were together, from the first A side to the way that kind of musical journey ends essentially with the sound of Paul McCartney going, it just seems like it's such a strange way to end your recording career, almost as if they were kind of sticking two fingers up at kind of everyone and be like, that's it, we're done, we've had enough.
Right.
um but within that, it's actually a really interesting song because there's not much to it kind of chordally, but sonically there's all sorts of kind of crazy stuff going on, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just a bit more background. So it was started from an idea by John Lennon, who apparently spotted the phrase "You know the name, look up the number" on a phone directory at McCartney's house while he was waiting for him to work, and he came up with this kind of mantra. He said later turned into a comedy record. I mean, that's part of it. It's certainly comic, isn't it? And then it seemed to have got because it was recorded initially with George Martin absent. I don't know.
Mm.
I always get this feeling that when he goes away, they're like kids, aren't they? In a sort of toy shop, they suddenly sort of get let loose a bit.
Well, they were. I mean, because I think if I've got the timing right in my head, it was sort of just at the tail end of the Pepper sessions, or they
Yeah,
kind of
they finished Pepper,
oh,
so yeah, it was kind of yeah, it's weird, isn't it? You think after finishing Pepper they'd have a rest, but they went straight in and started messing about.
yeah. And it's particularly that kind of immediately post Pepper that they sound like they're having fun. Sort of just before the Magical Mystery Tour and before they went to India, there's kind of a few kind of tracks that are kind of yeah, just the sound of them messing about, really. So whether they had any intention of it ever becoming a thing, or as with a lot of you know, their messing about in the studio, they were just doing it, and the Abbey
Yeah.
Road engineers were told just make sure you get it all down just in case. Yeah, I wonder whether that's why it maybe kind of sat on the back burner, as it was kind of a, yeah, more of a jam than a kind of you know a fully formed song or idea.
Yeah, and the whole band were involved, weren't they? I mean, John and Paul sort of led it, but yeah, that's Ringo and drums and George is playing. It is it was recorded in different parts, which so it seems like the concept from the very beginning was this idea of a sort of suite, although they are linked by obviously the phrase, which is constantly the same lyrics. Um, but should we go through each part? It'd be interesting to talk about because part one, it starts with those two interesting piano chords and what turns out to be a bass, very high register bass. And then into that kind of driving piano with quite a rocky vocal from John and Paul.
You know my name. Look up the number. You know my name. Look up the number. You know my name. You know my name.
I'm surprised that hasn't been sampled, because it's sort of it's so ripe for, having been like, I don't know, a late 90s Will Smith song or something. 'Cause it's a really contemporary sounding kind of like drum beat and groove that they got going on there. I assume it's just too expensive to sample the Beatles, which is why it's not happened. But yeah, it's kind of it sounds very un-60s. Like if someone had made that in the early 90s as some sort of like trip hop thing, I wouldn't be surprised. So it's kind of the surprise is that it was made in 67.
It's good groove. And it's interesting because the chord progression is quite simple. Like you say, it's sort of D, F sharp minor, G, A7. But there's as often with John's stuff, there's this sort of odd bar in there, isn't there? Odd bar or two, which throws out the sort of symmetry of it a little bit.
Yeah, I often think that's more by just kind of luck than judgment. There are quite a few versions of the song, so kind of I think some of the longer sections didn't get released on kind of the final B-side.
No, that comes later, doesn't it? Yeah. I think what's interesting is the sort of rock vocal. Is it a mock macho lead vocal, as one person described it, or is it sincere? It's hard to tell at this point, but obviously it descends into madness very
Yeah, I
soon.
mean, because I think that vocal was one of the ones they put on later in 69.
That's right. All the vocals were done later, yeah. So it's the backing tracks initially, yeah.
So it's kind of you've got that kind of juxtaposition of the fun naivety of 1967 and Lennon imminently about to divorce himself from the rest of the band. So maybe that's kind of that's what's coming out. So
That's the weird context of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it was shelved for so. I mean, the mystery of why it was picked up again hasn't been solved as far as I can tell. Nobody knows why they suddenly decided to come back to this, but there is definitely an air of playfulness that perhaps they really enjoyed. Interestingly, actually, while we talk about that, so it was going to be released in 1969 as a Plastic Ono Band single with John and Yoko and so on. But that idea was dropped and it became the B-side. And John edited it. So I was going to say the next part originally was a ska part. We'll come back to that because that was released eventually. But part two on the B-side was the kind of cabaret lounge slaggers bit, which goes into a Latin style groove, doesn't it, with lounge piano.
Good evening and welcome to Slaggers, featuring Dennis O'Bell. Ringo. Let's hear it for Dennis. Hey!
Good evening. You know my name. Never look up my number. You know my name. That's right. Look up my number. You know.
I think that's probably my favorite bit. I think looking back to when they did that bit in 67, that groove is exactly the same as one of the like automated grooves on the Mellotron that they had. Because there's one of the Mellotron backing tapes was like the dum and they basically copied it kind of note for note essentially. whether that was just by chance or, that's because that's what all the clubs sounded like in 1967. Sadly, I didn't get to experience them, so maybe that was just like a normal thing that everyone was doing. But I'd like to think that they were kind of trying to copy the machine that they'd just got that was copying bands, and it was kind of some weird.
Yeah, well, that's them experimenting with technology in the early days, isn't it? Well, the middle of the 60s. Yeah, and that's Slaggers line is hilarious. I know that Stephen Cockcroft on the Nothing Is Real podcast thinks it's Schlaggers, which not Slaggers. Schlaggers is a musical style in Germany, apparently, very sort of kitsch pop music style, which he thinks they're referring to there. Although I definitely hear it as Slaggers. I think most people do.
I've always heard it as Slaggers, but
Yeah. It's just a great kind of club name, isn't it? And then we go into the real comedy part, I suppose you'd say, isn't it? What many people call inspired by the Goon Show. It becomes a very odd rhythm, lots of silly high-pitched vocals, cuckoo clocks and bird whistles.
You know, you know, you know my name. You know my name. You know my name. Look up the number. You know my name. Look up the number. You know my name. Look up the number. You know my name. You know my number 2. You know my number 3. You know my name.
Possibly the Goons, but I've always heard it as like the influence of Vivian Stanshall, because whether they'd met at that point, because I know Paul produced Urban Spaceman around that time, and they obviously had the connection because they turned up on Magical Mystery Tour, the film. So whether that had kind of cross-pollinated into that bit.
I think they were big fans of the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band, weren't they? Yeah. So there was that feeling about it as well, yeah.
Which was kind of ties in with the time. And I think a lot of those sound effects were just because there was a box of toys underneath the stairs in Studio 2. Fairly sure that some of the same like cuckoo stuff turns up on Piper at the Gates of Dawn.
Yeah, things like that happen a lot. The cash register on one of the is it the cash register? I think turns up on Dark Side of the Moon, but was earlier used by the Beatles. I think it's that. Did you manage to get hands on any of that stuff while you were there?
I'm not sure that toy box is there anymore, but yeah, all the pianos and stuff are still there, so we used all of those and made sure we went in the echo chamber where lots of parties happen for Yellow Submarine and various other events in Studio 2. But yeah, in terms of kind of that section of the song, yeah, I mean they're just messing about really. That's certainly what it sounds like, and I'd assume that's what they were doing.
Absolutely, and having a lot of fun. We'll talk about Paul's reminiscence of it later, but clearly having fun at a time when they were feeling on top of the world, as you say. I know that they all felt very confident about this. Is before Sergeant Pepper's was released, but they just finished recording it. They must have been feeling super confident. They did in that interim period. They'd recorded Magical Mystery Tour, It's All Too Much, All Together Now. So they were coming up with looser stuff at this point, weren't they? And this is no doubt the loosest.
And again in my head, I'm not totally clear of the chronology, but things like Heroes and Villains and Good Vibrations, where it's using that kind of sectional concept.
Yeah.
Whether that come out, I mean, they'd probably heard it.
They would have heard Good Vibrations. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's got all of that. That sweetness. What's interesting is a few people have mentioned this, that it is a suite of different sections tied together with some harmonic chords, but it's not at all po-faced, and it maybe works better for it not being sort of super serious in a way.
They're having fun. They've taught the band the song 5 minutes before, and they're just doing it. It comes across with that kind of freshness of just, we don't really know what we're doing. Well, we'll try and get it
Yeah.
right. If not, we'll just do it again.
The final part of the original, well, sorry, original, the version that ended up on the B-side was the cool kind of jazzy, swingy vibe at
Mm.
the end, wasn't it? Where it goes into a kind of smoky late night atmosphere.
I'm assuming that was Paul that was playing the kind of piano solo thing, and the like, because it's actually really good. It's a very tasteful way of like bringing the band back in. Um,
George is on the vibraphone,
yeah.
playing vibes. So George is still involved. And Ringo's swinging quite nicely, I think, on the ride cymbal. You said it was Paul's kind of a grunting at the end, but I always thought that was John at the end of this section doing his grunts, but who knows?
Oh, yeah, I don't know. It's kind of
I know that Paul was the Dennis O'Bell
yeah.
figure in the previous section. So, but yeah. And then, of course, we've got the big guest star, Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones on sax.
I mean, he's a great guitarist.
That's a good, yeah, that's a good sidestep.
It's well, of that time they're all having fun and inviting each other round to kind of play on stuff. But yeah, I think kind of ambition more than capability, possibly.
Well, isn't it interesting? Because apparently, so Paul had invited him to the studio, and this was at a time, it's worth remembering that the Rolling Stones were going through quite a bad time. They were being busted, and Brian had actually been a bit ostracized from Mick and Keith. So I don't know whether Paul was sort of extending an olive branch because he says he always got on well with Brian Jones, but
Mm.
he didn't know that he was going to bring it. He thought he'd bring a guitar, didn't he? He said Paul had said that. I was surprised when he turned up with a saxophone. But Brian Jones was well, a multi-instrumentalist, very talented multi-instrumentalist, wasn't he? He played a lot of instruments on the most recent Rolling Stones albums, harpsichords and sitars, and. So maybe he was just thinking, I'll challenge myself and try the sax. But actually, Paul says it was, Paul McCartney says it was a bit ropey, but it was perfect for what they were trying to capture in this section.
Indeed. I assume that kind of that sax is in the bit that got edited out with the kind of scar section. Is I think you can hear the kind of benefit of Brian's saxophone there probably a bit more because on the edited version, I think there's that solo that is, works for the song.
Right, yeah, yeah. I can see you being as diplomatic as possible, just in case Paul's listening, or well, Brian can't because he's gone, isn't he? Yeah, in fact, he never got to hear this because he drowned before they released it, didn't he? Yeah, we've also got Mal Evans doing some stuff with gravel. Again, no idea why.
I mean, I know that he's on it, but I kind of listened through and I'm struggling to hear the gravel. I think again, it's just one of those, it would make a great sound and in amongst everything.
So those are the four sections that originally were laid down. Well, sorry, that were originally heard on the B-side. But there was a cut there because Lennon had, as I said, cut this down to 4 minutes for the B-side. The first we officially heard of the entire version was on the Anthology 2 album, 1996.
Yeah.
And there we get the full version with the inclusion of the ska part.
whether it's because I'm just familiar with the one that came out kind of on the on the single. Personally, I prefer it without that cigar section in there. I presume that was Paul putting that bit in because he loves a bit of reggae or ska or, you know, frequently kind of putting those sort of sections into songs. So I assume that was his kind of, you know, let's try and get this groove in here somehow. To my ears, it doesn't add to the song.
I Call Your Name has a ska section in it, which is very early in '64, and of course they Obla Di Obla Da is famously meant to be their first white reggae record. But yeah, I presume. I mean, obviously John had to cut something, and maybe he saw that as the weakest part.
And again, you know, coming back to it as he would have done, you know, a few years down the line, it kind of fresh ears and fresh perspectives. And they'd probably heard enough of Obla Di Obla Da during the tracking. It's like, I'm not having that again, and just cut that whole section out.
It's worth mentioning actually that because of the way John had mixed it for the B-side, it was a mono recording, so we hadn't heard it in stereo until that anthology version. So that's another good reason to listen to, I think, to the anthology version, which has that stereo soundscape.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's kind of by the nature of the song, you know, they it feels like they've kind of just threw together what they'd done into a thing rather than, you know, having 178 takes of the song. So yeah, I've certainly not heard any kind of rumors of, you know, there's a 15-minute version and it's got, you know.
Oh, well, it's funny you say that. There is. It's commonly talked about that the first section there was a 20-minute jam just on that, but it's never been released. So a lot of Beatles fans would like to hear that part one section as a 20-minute jam. I'm not sure how well it will work, but
maybe Paul will release it as a limited 12-inch with Carnival of Light one day.
that's what we want, Paul, if you're listening. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So as you say, what's interesting about this track, I mean, there's lots of interesting things about it. First of all, why, you know, the mystery really of what it was meant to be. Was it just messing around? What made them think about coming back to it? I mean, the fact they got, you know, Brian Jones on it makes you think that they had something in mind, but it never saw the light of day, so it sat on the shelf. Then, you know, the second thing is why they came back to it for this, you know, in 1969. I mean, John was going to release it with What's the New Mary Jane as a single for the Plastic Ono Band, and presumably, I mean, that's another crazy song, isn't it? Very loose and experimental, jokey song.
I assume just the rest of the band kind of vetoed that and said, well, you know, it's not a Plastic Ono Band. It's like, that's us, so no. And my guess is that was probably Paul saying, look, we're better than that. So yeah. We're doing Abbey Road, as I think they would have been at the time.
Yeah, that's right. They were just getting into Abbey Road. In fact, the vocals were recorded after the day after Oh Darling vocals, I think, to give you some context. It's a dark period for them. I mean, Paul was very much, you know, antagonistic towards John and the others. There was a lot of legal stuff going down. I mean, my best interpretation, I don't know about you, is that it was one of those where they were so in such darkness in terms of their relationship that they wanted to bring back some of the light and playfulness that they'd experienced, and that song came to mind. You know, that Paul and John thought, well, that was great fun doing that. Let's bring that back. You know.
Possibly. I mean, I'd like to think that. I wonder whether there's also a sense of, you know, scratching around for a B-side and they're like, oh, that'll do. Yeah, maybe kind of reality is somewhere in between. Because at the time that they were recording that, was Brian Jones still alive?
So he died in July 1969, and the vocal part was being recorded in April. So yeah, he was still alive. Yeah.
Yeah, in the back of my mind, maybe that was a trigger of like, oh, you remember when we had that messing around, and they've kind of looked back on that.
Yeah, so it doesn't. There's no sort of rationale for it. I mean, I can't believe they didn't have other things they could have put on the B-side. I mean, you know, the sort of irony, if you want to call it irony, of it is it's the last. Really, it's the last thing they released. If you want to look at it that way, it's the last official single, Let It Be, by the band. And so it was the B-side of the last official single. It was also the last track to ever be released on an album that was officially recorded. So it finally ended up on Past Masters and Rarities. So in a way, it's the end of the Beatles, isn't it? And they've
Yeah.
always had this thing about undermining the gravity of something like that, haven't they? Like, I don't know. I always like, the end of Sergeant Pepper, where you got the very profound E chord that ends "Day in the Life," and then you've got this chatter at the end just to sort of undermine it slightly.
Um, and similarly after the rooftop gig of hope we pass the audition, and
Yeah, yeah, it happens a lot. And in this case, Let It Be, very sort of hymnal,
Mm.
you know, profound song, feels like the sort of undercutting that profundity with joy and jokiness. Maybe that's my sort of take on it.
I mean, it certainly feels like when you see it in the context of everything they've done, a strange choice to end your career with. Which I
Absolutely.
think by the time they did that, I think they all knew it had finished. It's almost like they're kind of irreverent about their own achievements.
Yeah, I think there's something there, and yeah, it feels. I mean, how do you end the Beatles? And I know that's another good example, isn't it? The end of Abbey Road, where you've got that very beautiful suite, and then the end, and then they somehow have to add in Her Majesty just to undercut it.
I
Um,
always
I get the feeling there's something they feel uncomfortable about being profound,
yeah,
and they always feel like they've got to do that Liverpudlian jokiness of sort of a sly little dig at that before. So
yeah,
maybe that was it. Maybe that was it. Just musically, it's. I think it's actually there are some really interesting moments, aren't there? I mentioned earlier that G sharp diminished chord. I mean, it's fleeting, but I love it. I always listen out for it. In the final section where he on the piano, there's a little sort of chromatic climb up. I always love listening out for things like that. Um, but yeah, it's slightly more musically sophisticated than it might sound on first hearing, I think.
yeah. But I think some of those, well, a lot of those songs of the Beatles and all bands, kind of when they're written down, they they seem way more complicated in jazz than they really are. Because
That's true. Yeah.
whereas as a kid, I'd be trying to figure out like what some of the chords that have been written in like the beat, excuse me, the Beatles complete were. It's just like what the hell is that chord? And actually, it's just they're doing an A7 shape and they're just shuffling one finger up or just sliding, and somebody kind of who's gone through the Royal Schools of Music or whatever has sat there and transcribed it exactly, and it's just like, well, some of that is just fluffing it. I mean, particularly for a song like this where it's essentially four chords just jamming round, and yeah, you'll maybe just occasionally do like if you're playing it on the piano, you just naturally put in the odd variation and that sort of thing. So
Hmm.
I think it's just sort of just comping it or vamping it or whatever the term is.
Yeah, and those little accidents of chromaticisms occur as
Mm.
that as part of that, but they always feel like little highlights to me, just because I'm a bit nerdy about chords and things. Um, there doesn't seem to have been much precedent for it, although I've a few people have talked about how the Rolling Stones, the final track on Between the Buttons, which was the album they released in January 1967. The track called Something Happened to Me Yesterday has
Mm.
a similar sort of vibe at the end where Jagger's sort of emceeing it. I mean, there's a bit of a vibe there that may have influenced it. I don't know.
Well, thank you very much. And now I think it's time for us all to go. So from all of us to all of you, not forgetting the boys in the band and our producer, Reg Thorpe, we'd like to say God bless.
I wonder whether some of it is kind of the not from the rock and roll bands of that era, and it's more kind of the Mrs. Mills Party album, or
Yeah.
those sorts of things that were widely listened to at the time and kind of part of the culture, and they're sort of leaning into that.
Yeah, it was an anything goes atmosphere, wasn't it? I mean, I also wonder, again, stretching a bit maybe, but Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention had released Freak Out and were just about to release when they started on this, Absolutely Free. And there's a song at the end of that called America Drinks and Goes Home, which is very similar in vibe to this, but it was released after they started recording this. So I don't think it would have influenced them.
just like I say, there's no regrets. Well, it's about time to close. I hope you've had as much fun as we have. Don't forget to...
So yeah, I think it's part of that where rock and roll maybe, and certainly the Beatles were looking for inspiration from everywhere. The Bonzo Dog Doodah Band, yeah, Mrs. Mills, yeah, all of it was ska, and it was all going into this kind of melting pot of new sounds and new inspirations, wasn't it?
And then continued that journey, because particularly that kind of comedy club singer thing, has reappeared many times over the years since, with Star Turn or Vic Reeves or any number of people that sounds exactly like, whether it's Paul, whether it's John, kind of doing the stuff.
Yeah. Is there anything that is it something about overall the track overall that you think appeals to you? Is it that experimentation? Is it that joyfulness, or is it something else that comes together for you in this song?
I think it's maybe coming from, because I produce all sorts of music myself, and I like the kind of the hard cut of where stuff is recorded in sections, and it'll suddenly go from the sound of the room is completely different at this section, and you can hear that the way that my name kind of progresses through the song. So I think it kind of, even before I understood what they were doing, it would catch my ear, where they're kind of cutting from one bit and it's like a hard cut. I think I first heard it when from Past Masters Volume 2, which I think I managed to get a copy from the library when I was about 13, and I'm trying to listen to the entire kind of back catalogue of the Beatles, and finally got to that one. It's like, this is like a bit like the first time you hear Tomorrow Never Knows. It's just like, quite different to a lot of the other songs that they've got.
I often say, you're not the only person to have chosen this. In this case, you do share this with somebody else. A certain somebody called Paul McCartney from Liverpool has said that it was his favourite Beatles song.
Well, good to be in good company.
Yeah. Have you read that quote? So he said, "People are only just discovering things like You Know My Name, probably my favourite Beatles track, just because it's so insane. All the memories. We had these endless, crazy, fun sessions, and it was just hilarious to put that record together." I mean, John had said that it was a piece of unfinished music that I turned into a comedy record with Paul. So he had, that's his memory of it. And again, that sort of plays into that theory that maybe that's why they resurrected it. Maybe Paul said, "You remember that track that was just great fun to do?" That's always been my interpretation. But
I mean, it makes sense. And particularly at that time where they were, not in the best place.
Now, I mentioned about favourite Beatles tracks. I will, it's unfair, of course, to push you into one. Do you have any others that you'd like to give honourable mention to? Maybe ones that you would have chosen if you could have, but were already chosen?
I mean, I could probably narrow it down the opposite. What's my least favourite Beatles song? It's about 99% of my listening.
Okay. And it changes regularly, no doubt, your favourite?
I mean, a lot of my favourite stuff is some of the kind of solo stuff from the time. So things like the Family Way album that Paul McCartney did.
Oh, yeah.
And all that instrumental stuff. I really love that. And also side B of Yellow Submarine, where it's all...
the George Martin, yeah.
Tends to be what I listen to a lot. I've just got a real thing for like mid-60s instrumental music, because it's got particularly kind of around 1966, because it's got an enthusiasm and a kind of like a joy that starts to get a bit darker as you get into the later 60s. But we're going way off on a tangent of Beatles stuff. I mean, I think I said earlier, Yellow Submarine, I think, is probably quite up there in terms of its importance as a recording, not necessarily as a song. And even the ones that are my least favourite, I still listen to endlessly. So this is kind of...
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about your music, because you've made, well, you said 13, 14 albums, the latest of which is Au Contraire, fantastic album I recommend people listen to, and I'll put a link to in the show notes. Your music's been described as a kind of, well, been compared to the likes of Cheap Trick, yes, the Beatles, Squeeze, that kind of area.
Happenstance will find yourself
Yeah, is there anything on the horizon? What are you working on next?
Yeah, I've got two albums kind of underway. The one that we were recording at Abbey Road, which I'm hoping comes out next summer.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, that's kind of a real treat for kind of well for me actually. I make all the music for me. It's quite nice that other people enjoyed listening to it as well. So that was yeah, been recorded with like all the Beatles pianos and recording kind of Ringo kits in Studio 2 and very speed tape and all that sort of stuff.
Great.
I've got an album of mid 60s stroke early 70s sounding library music based on the architecture of Croydon's mid-century and post-war rebuilding, which
Okay.
I'm releasing as a walking tour, just to be incredibly niche. So it's an
Yeah.
walking tour, which seeing as a lot of my listeners live in LA and Barcelona, I'm fairly sure nobody is ever going to actually listen to it. 'Cause you need to walk around Croydon town centre to get the full effect. But
Brilliant.
uh, I've also got kind of alongside the stuff that I do, I've got a side project called The Rebuttals.
Yeah, I was going to bring this up. So this is going to be of great interest. I loved it. Yeah. Tell me about that because the volume one was released, was it 2021?
It was so it's kind of yeah I'm a huge fan of the Beatles and 60s recording techniques and the style of 60s songwriting and that sort of thing. But it's quite it can be a bit restricting if you say, well, this is what I do as a songwriter, and I'm just going to be kind of sound like I live in 1966, which I don't. Um, so it came up with, as most things do, like a stupid conversation in a pub of like, yeah, what would the Ruttles have done if they'd stayed together? Um, so the imaginary Ruttles. So I came up with a spoof of the Ruttles and kind of did their imagined solo careers. So there's things that are kind of spoofing Live and Let Die, and Free as a Bird, and
Maybe I'm amazed. Yeah.
Maybe I'm Amazed,
Mm.
which I wrote in all my favorite kind of musical friends who are very good at doing a Lennon voice or a Macca voice, or playing drums in exactly the style of Ringo. So we did that, and it went down annoyingly far better than all my proper music did.
The devil may care, then you're on your own. A reason to hope, a reason to climb.
I love it. It's a great album.
And then they were all like, "We've got to do this again." I was just like, "Well, seeing as I started at the end, the only way I could go was backwards." So I did kind of a spoof of the Blue album. So it's kind of a spoof of what the Ruttles would do if they were doing kind of a Blue album. Um, and yeah, that was a lot of fun to make. Weirdly, the songs kind of write themselves because you're just like, oh, I can do something in the style of whatever it is, and they were written in 5 minutes and kind of um, recorded alongside. As at the time, I was recording an album called Bivouac, which is kind of a 23-track concept album about the downfall of post-industrial Britain. It's 5 stars, Shindig magazine. Don't go by my description. I don't sell my music well. But we were recording the Ruttles, sorry, the Ruttles, the Rebuttals during the same sessions. So we do all these like quite, involved, serious songs. And then we do kind of a spoof of Obla Obla Da, and then we do the next song. So it's all kind of recorded at the same time, which
Right.
a lot of fun to make.
There's something. It's like a sort of fairground mirror, isn't it? Of like the Beatles, the Ruttles, the rebuttals. I'm just waiting for somebody to do a de-rebuttals thing of what you would have done. So it just goes on infinitely. Yeah.
I guess if I do it again, which inevitably I'll do because I'm just forever writing songs, it might just have to go kind of a bit further back and do something like the Star Club or like a skiffle band.
So, well, how would readers find out more about what you do and where you release stuff?
You can find me at nickfrater.com. Yeah, I try and keep stuff up to date there, but it's not very up to date at the moment. I've got a few gigs coming up as me, but I also play keyboards for Love, and they're touring over in spring of next year, doing the Love album and Da Capo. So if you want to come and say hi, I'll be doing the harpsichords and stuff for Orange Skies and all the rest of it, which I think's 2nd of May at Shepherd's Bush Empire.
Fantastic. Any social media handles you want to share?
Yeah, at Nick Frater Music, I think, on Instagram. I've given up with most other channels. Life's too short for social media.
But thank you so much for giving me some time today to talk about the Beatles and specifically You Know My Name, Look Up the Number. It's been great.
Thank you for having me in. There's always time for the Beatles.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Thanks for listening to My Favourite Beatles Song. If you like the podcast, please consider giving it a rating or review on your favourite podcast platform. This helps me to reach new listeners. You can follow the podcast on x.com, Instagram and Facebook. Look for the links in the show notes. Thanks to Joe Kane for the fantastic music and Mark Cunningham for the logo design. I'll see you next time.